There are two figures of note in the Bible named Joseph, one in the New Testament and one in the Old Testament. The one in the New Testament is the husband of Mary. Everyone knows that Joseph. On Christmas especially, we remember. But the other Joseph is in the Old Testament near the very beginning, in the book of Genesis. And that Joseph will be the subject of these 8 conferences. Please welcome him. Please be seated. We just began. This Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob. Everyone remembers that original trinity of biblical figures, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob. Jacob had 12. And so Joseph is near the end of that line. And of the 12 sons of Jacob, he is the one about whom we know much, much more than the others. In fact, in the whole book of Genesis, Joseph is the most important character in terms of how much story of his life we are told. It's practically a novel that we are given. The book of Genesis covers thousands of years of history, and most lives are just mentioned in brief passing. But Joseph, from birth to death, this very exciting drama is told to us with significant detail. We have to ask ourselves why, with all the sparse detail of all the other characters, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob don't have as much as Joseph does. Why so much about him? Normally when a great deal of biographical information is given, it's because the life itself is kind of a key which unlocks the reader of the text, or in the case of the assembly, the hearer of the text. These texts are all meant to be heard, much more than they were meant to be read. Most people for thousands of years never read them, couldn't even read. They heard them, and they heard them in the assembly. And to hear a story about a great life is a key to unlock many lives. Most lives are unlocked by really great figures. And Joseph is one of the greatest. We have to go a long way in the Bible to find someone whose personal life is so helpful, so opening of the soul as Joseph. Probably David is the next great figure in the Bible. And then you have to go from David to Jesus. There are 3 figures who, when you read their story with an open eye and an open heart, you have to weep from time to time. They're profound, they're exciting, they're dramatic, poignant. So that story deserves to be told carefully. That's why I think 7 or 8 sessions is not too many sessions to give to a great life, a great biography. In fact, for many of us, only a great biography will open us. We live in a culture which is so divided. God forbid we talk about politics in this assembly. God forbid we talk about the president or the Congress, or we talk about policies, or we talk about the economy. God forbid we'll just be throwing shoes at each other. If we just talk about the great issues of the day, our hearts and minds are practically closed against the other side. That's never a good place to start. What's a good place to start is a great life. Put all the other stuff aside of the big issues. Put all the stuff aside about the little issues, like our income, our taxes, our debts, our age, our ailments, our friendships, our follies, our failures. That's the little stuff. I once knew a guy in prison. He had a wife who visited him every Sunday, faithfully. It was very hard for her. She was weeping all the time. And I said to him, "Why is your wife so faithful to visit you?" "That's easy," he said. "We made a decision a long time ago. So we divided the jobs between us. I do all the big decisions, and she does all the little decisions." Well, so how does that work practically? He says, "Well, I get to decide whether or not we go to war with Iran. I get to decide whether or not we make a tariff with China. She decides where we live, what jobs we do, what shopping we do, what we own. She makes the little decisions." Yeah, well, the little decisions. Yeah, those are the little decisions, but the only ones that matter. Joseph is a story which helps us to go back to life and make the little decisions better. If we just stick in the middle of all the mud, of all the little decisions we have to make, we are going to get quagmired in that mud. Sometimes we have to step out of the mud and look at somebody else's life, especially someone who has a bigger life than the average. Not necessarily a better one, not necessarily a happier one, but one which has consequences and significances which are big. Just to sit back and admire somebody for a long time is a way of washing the mud off. Suddenly we can go back into our life and make clean decisions when before we were bogged down with messy ones. Admiration is one of the finest forms of love. It's high intimacy. And there's very little admiration left in our society. We are the most cynical age of all. We think of nothing better than to drag whoever is the best politician or the best actor or the best athlete, the best minister. We think nothing is better than to drag that one off that pedestal and into the mud. That makes us all feel somehow so much better. Well, I think it gives us all a little bit of an excuse not to clean up things ourselves. Well, why should we? Look at all these hypocrites everywhere, all these failures. But admiration is a way of saying, I'm getting up. I'm going to do what I see the other do well. I'm going to try and be what I see the other exhibit well. That's a tough sell in the 21st century, to say that anyone is worthy of our admiration. When you say that, people look at you with a smug look of, aren't you naive? Maybe it's naive. Since after all, as the Bible says, all men have sinned. So maybe there's no one admirable. But given that we're all within that context, some people are certainly more admirable than others. In fact, truth be told, it's precisely because the human condition is a mess and everything we do is shot through with failure. Precisely for that reason, anything we do which is decent makes it all the more admirable. We should be all the more impressed when somebody can raise their head above the tragedies of this life and do something well done. And we can say, if you want to be a strict Orthodox believer, you can say, well, he did it by grace. Perfect. Say so. But people do act graciously from time to time, even if they don't know about the Word or the theology of it. God is generous enough. If there is a God in heaven, he would be generous by his nature to pour that grace all around and not just reserve it for the few who believe in all the right things. That would be rather stingy of creators. So Joseph is a gracious figure. Everything he does is touched by it. And that's a relief for us to see someone who's almost unfailingly noble in his life. And that's why I think he's a very worthwhile figure. About him, many books have been written. Novels, short stories, mini TV series, movies have been made. And there's a musical, Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. For that reason, I advertised this particular series, Joseph and his coat of second chances, to tie his life to ours. Because when we allow someone to move us by admiration, we can perhaps rise up to the second chances which are afforded us at this opportunity. And there's a second chance. As long as we draw breath, we can draw the next breath more decently than the last one. Even if it's our last breath, we can do something along those lines to exhale favorably and graciously and inhale with hope. So I want to look at him, I think someone said to me recently, from the pit to the palace. The story of Joseph is a story of enormous resilience. What I like about him, what I find so attractive, at every turn he has one basic conviction that is so firmly held, it's almost breathless. Joseph never doubts that he is well loved. From his childhood to his deathbed, he believes he is well loved. You just can't convince him otherwise. No matter what reversals he suffers, and he suffers significant reversals, he still thinks, yeah, but underneath they love me, or underneath somebody loves me. And that's more important than all the rejection and all the trouble that I am suffering. And that conviction of Joseph, the 11th son, is something that most people could pause and think, what could I do in my life if I was sure I was well loved? If I never doubted, if I was never hesitant, if I was never afraid of rejection. I was never afraid of rejection. What could I do? Imagine. That's what Joseph does. He's not afraid. There are 10 commandments in the Bible, but in fact there are hundreds or thousands of little commandments all over about what we should do and shouldn't do. The most frequent commandment, do not be afraid. It's repeated everywhere, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And Joseph is the most obedient figure in the Bible to that commandment. He is not afraid. And that is a compelling character sketch for him that makes him very much worth our interest, because that is within our grasp. Somehow, it is within our grasp to believe that we are well loved. Even if we haven't until this moment believed it, that would somehow be the act of faith or the act of the biblical religion that would be worthy for anybody, believer or disbeliever, to contemplate. Like, that's a pretty decent psychological, social, emotional commandment. Be persuaded you are well loved, i.e., don't be afraid, because they are about the same thing. We are not that far from the kingdom of God, if one must see it so, to believe that we are well loved. Well, then Joseph is a figure worthy of our consideration. It's a wonderful thing to consider at every turn in the story of Joseph for the next 8 sessions, to consider how he exercises that obedience or that conviction. So perhaps from time to time I will make it explicit again. Well, let me then position Joseph a little bit for us historically or in biblical literature. We're talking about 4,000 years ago, more or less. No one is sure of the patriarchal period. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, probably around 2000 BC, give or take. The context for Abraham, you might remember, has to do with a terrific cosmological event that happened near the Dead Sea, for which now, in most recent years, meteorologists, scientists have determined there is, in fact, some significant historical link. There was a terrific explosion about 2000 BC, and it overturned a mountain range and destroyed settlements from one side of the Dead Sea to the other. We know of that as Sodom and Gomorrah. Fire and brimstone fell from heaven. Well, now it's pretty demonstrable that in fact there was a significant meteor hit, a strike, and it accomplished something akin to what is described in the book of Genesis. So we were able to more or less position Abraham to those days anyways, 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. But evidence begins to accumulate that that is probably a reasonable time to imprint that character. Abraham, of course, is the foundation, the anchor of that personality we call the father of the covenant. So, the covenant of Abraham begins there, 2000 BC, more or less. And the next 4,000 years are in the consequence of his agreement to a covenant, a relationship, a bond between heaven and earth, that he was going to believe that he was chosen, and that the choice that was his would live through him and his descendants all the way, somehow or other, even to us. That is more or less the received perspective of our tradition. And that's a tradition which is spread from China to Africa to North and South America to Australia. It's all over the world now. The biblical tradition, the biblical heritage has made that covenant at least universally dispersed. Even if not everyone accepts it, everyone knows about it. And even those who have shrugged it off are still somehow in its shadow. We're under the umbrella of it culturally. It's part of our heritage. We can't get away from it. So we're not going to get away from it. We're going to look at it. Abraham's heritage. Abraham itself is worthy of a whole summer vacation Bible school, or Isaac, his descendant. We won't be spending too much time on Abraham and Isaac. We're looking at Jacob's son. Jacob had 12 sons. So when I want to talk about Joseph, he is the heir of the covenant, the inheritor of the essential thread of that covenant. It passes from Abraham to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, and from Jacob, most of all, to Joseph. Of all his sons, Joseph is the one who says, I got it. And it passes through me to Israel, to the children of Israel, and from Joseph then to us. So we're going to examine why he was, of all the 12 sons of Jacob, why he was the likeliest one to bear the thread of that covenant. Again, a covenant is a bond, it's a relationship. It's a way of being loved. It's a way of being secure. It's a way of saying, I'm not afraid. It's a way of saying, I belong. This world is a place where I'm supposed to be, and I have a place in it. There's a niche for me. Doesn't mean I'm better than anyone else. I could be worse, but I have a place. That's the thing about family life. You could have somebody you habitually dislike in your family, but he has a place in your family. And that's different between a family and a city. In a city, when there's someone who's just disliked, they may be homeless. They may have no place. But in a family, nobody's homeless. That's your family. So the heritage, the covenant, passes. The bond of friendship, the society, the commerce of affection, of loyalty, of security passes through Joseph. So we're going to examine him in that context. In order to examine the life of Joseph, we should, like most lives, we should examine the embrace from which his life derived. We all come from an embrace. Most, well, until the 21st century, things are changing. But until now, every human being comes from somebody's embrace. There's a husband and a wife, a father and a mother, whether it be casual or passing or temporary or permanent. There's an embrace. We spring from there. It could be a disastrous embrace. It could be the worst possible combination of characters. They could be colossal losers. But for a moment, something sparked. And voila, here we are. Joseph came from that embrace of his father, Jacob, and his mother, Rachel. And that was an exciting bond. We're going to talk about Joseph as he springs from that bond. I will overlook the prior history. And we'll get right to that interesting bond. We're going to turn to the 29th chapter of the book of Genesis. After Jacob resumed his journey, he came to the land of the Easterners. Looking about, he saw a well in the open country with 3 droves of sheep huddled near it. For droves were watered from that well. Now a large stone covered the mouth of that well. Only when all the shepherds were assembled could they then roll away the stone from the mouth of the well and water the flocks. Then they would put the stone back again over the mouth of the well. That's the setting when Jacob is going to meet Rachel, his future bride. And I should mention that meeting people at the well, that's the biblical place of meeting. It's the watering hole. Have you ever heard of a bar called the watering hole? It's not so different. At the end of the day, you go home from work, you stop off at the watering hole, and you might meet your future wife. You might. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, give or take, the women of the ancient world would drive their sheep to the well to water them. Because at 4 o'clock, the sun had passed its zenith and the breeze shifted from the land to the sea. The temperature fell, the humidity dropped, and it was pleasant enough to take out the sheep to the well. You'd water them. And so the men would go to the well because the ladies would be taking the sheep there. And that's why the watering hole became a place to meet. And so then maybe the men would say, can I help you with those sheep? Aren't they considerate? So that's where Jacob ends up at around 4 or 5 o'clock at the watering hole. Jacob said to the women who came to the well, where are you from? We are from Haran, they replied. Click, click, click. So if you've read the first 28 chapters of the Bible, you know that Haran is the ancestral capital where Abraham and Isaac came and from where their spouses came. That's like the place where the covenant folk come. We are from Haran, they replied. Then he asked them, do you know Laban, son of Nahor? That's a relative of Abraham. We do, they answered. He inquired further, is he well? He is. They're very polite. They're very polite about meetings. He is, they answered. And here comes his daughter Rachel with his flock. Then he said, there is still much daylight left. It is hardly the time to bring the animals home. Why don't you water the flocks now, and then continue pasturing them? We cannot, they replied, until all the shepherds are here to roll the stone away from the mouth of the well. Only then can we water the flock. So remember, the stone is too heavy for these girls. The men have arranged it. Men made cabinets which are too high for women to reach, so that we can do something in the kitchen and claim we did our pieces, right? We did it. We reached up there. Look at that. I did that. And we made pickle jars too tight. So it's one thing we can do every once in a while. There's a couple little things we do, right? We do that so that we get 50% credit. They made the stone over the well too heavy for the ladies to move. So we can't do anything. We got to wait for the menfolk to move that stone away. And then they got to be the big guys, right? We moved that stone for you. That's basically the setup here. Now, while he was still talking, Rachel arrived with her father's sheep. She saw the one who tended them. She was the one who tended them. As soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban, with the sheep of his uncle Laban, he went up from the mouth of the well. He went up and rolled away the stone by himself. He went up and rolled away the stone from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Just to pause. We were just told several verses that it took 3 or 4 guys. They had to wait for 3 or 4 guys. Now, there's nothing about Jacob until this moment which strikes anyone as being terribly muscular. In fact, he was not the muscular brother of the 2 brothers. It was his brother Esau, who was the outdoorsman, who was the rough and ready one. Jacob was the mama's boy, we're going to find out. Jacob was not the guy to be lifting big, heavy stones all by himself. In fact, we already knew he had a bad sciatic nerve. He had a bad hip. He was walking with a limp all his life. So this is not what we expect from Jacob. So something has just happened here, and we call it adrenaline. He saw a woman that he never saw before, and he walked right up to that stone, and he moved it. Now, you can say that's something peculiar about the strength of Jacob. That's what I would have said, but when I think about it, I think, really? It's something about peculiar power of Rachel. That's what that's about. And I think women everywhere have kind of like this. Like, they can do that. They can empower a guy. They can make him do something he couldn't have done otherwise. They can make him stronger, better than he had been. More courageous, more decent even. Maybe braver. And that's what Rachel did. She just appeared there, and suddenly he's Superman. And he moves the stone all by himself. But listen about Superman. Verse 9. While he was still, verse 11. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and burst into tears. He kissed her and burst into tears. They haven't even met. They don't even know each other's name. And he kisses her. Well, all his boundaries have collapsed. All his borders. All his common sense has fallen apart. Now, believe me, if Rachel was a modern girl, she'd say, #MeToo, that guy would be arrested, there'd be a lawsuit, there'd be a sexual harassment thing, because he's acting like an idiot, and he's intimidating me, and I'm afraid of him, and I'm... well, I'm sorry. That's probably true, and he should be arrested. But then the covenant would never have gone anywhere, because this is a very important moment. This is the moment we call falling in love at first sight. That's a profound thing. That has been measured. Scientists have measured. You can actually see the dilation of the pupil. The pupil bursts wide for a split second, and all the light pours in to the optic nerve. And the man is overwhelmed. And the face he's looking at that did that to him is the only thing he sees. And that face is now burned into his soul. His brain is changed in a single moment. He's fallen in love. He's dizzy. He bursts into tears. He's wounded. He's stronger than he's ever been. And he's weaker than he's ever been. That's what Rachel did. And in a way, that must be something like the original plan. That must be something close to God's design, if you read the Bible and take it at face value. What happens here is just half a verse, and you can pass right over it and not get it. But I wouldn't pass over this too quickly. When Eve was made from the rib of Adam, he was sleeping. And then God woke him up and said, voila, here. And Adam gasped and said, this one at last. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. He gasped. His life was now complete. It had been half a life, less. An empty life, a forlorn life, a pointless life. And then he saw her, and he was overwhelmed. This one at last. He didn't even know there was an at last until he saw her. Then he realized it was all pointless until now. He was probably perky, doing his little gardening and having his little tasks. You know, the adolescent who was busy with his hobbies, interested in cars. And then everything is reversed all at once. This one at last. That's the experience here with Jacob. He didn't know how pointless, empty, and meaningless his life was until he saw her. And now everything is reoriented. This whole world is changing. It's shifting. He's throwing out his past. He doesn't know it yet. He's throwing it all away. He's making a whole new future. You have to have a bit of a character to do that. We don't ask 12-year-olds. 12-year-olds are capable of becoming emotionally involved with the opposite sex. But we kind of think, let them grow up and get a bit of a character first so that they can actually sustain the enthusiasm of that moment with something like a commitment that can keep it going in one direction for the rest of their life. In order to promise your life in one direction, you need a bit of a character. In order to have a bit of a character, you probably can't be 12. You probably can't be 12. So parents are all busy, like making sure that their 12-year-olds don't get into trouble. Because they're capable of becoming excited and emotionally invested. And they're capable of making tremendous enthusiasms for catastrophic consequences. So by this point, though, Jacob is not a spring chicken. He's come through quite a few ringers by now. He's well worn and seasoned. He's ready for this. And so this passage is a very important one for him. One might have thought that he was too old for this. He might have. His father would have thought, no, he's not falling in love. He's one of those businessmen that never do, right? Accountants or something. Just their noses in the ledger. But he did fall in love after all. He burst into tears and kissed her. He told her that he was her father's relative. We would call kissing cousins. They made sure they married within a certain degree of consanguinity, of what we call relations. And she was the right distance to marry. And Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob. He hurried out to meet him, embracing and kissing him. He brought him to the house. Jacob then recounted to Laban all that had happened. And Laban said to him, "You are indeed my flesh and my blood." So that's the beginning of the story. And that is the kind of conviction that from which Joseph was conceived. Tremendous affection and outpouring. Now, that bond of Jacob and Rachel begins here at that well. But it is not consummated for a long time. That bond, with so much promise, so much enthusiasm, so much zeal, is frustrated for 14 years. So Jacob had a troubled life until that time. And for the next 14 years, he's going to have a frustrated life because he's not going to get her to be his wife. He thinks he is. And he's going to be frustrated by his father-in-law. So the text from Genesis chapter 29 reads like this. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, that I may consummate my marriage with her, for now my term of work is complete." 7 years. So Laban invited all the local inhabitants and gave a wedding feast. At nightfall, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob consummated the marriage with her. In the morning, Jacob was amazed. It was Leah, not Rachel. He cried out to Laban from one tent to the next, "How could you have done this to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served 7 years for you? Why did you dupe me?" He must have gotten him drunk at the wedding. How else? Right? "How could you do this to me?" Laban replied, "To marry off a younger daughter before an elder one, that is not our custom. Finish the bridal week with this one, and then I will give you the other one too, in return for another 7 years of service with me." Jacob agreed. He finished the bridal week for Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel in marriage 14 years after the original contract. First Leah, and then 7 more years for Rachel. 14 years. She didn't look like the same thing anymore. When you're 18 years old and you've got 7, okay, 25. But now we're talking 32. She looks rather different. How much did Jacob love her? It didn't matter that her looks changed. And you know what's even more wonderful than that? She didn't bear him a child for years and years. And so the unhappy story unfolds that Leah has children, and Leah's maidservant has children, and Rachel's servant has children. Everyone's having children to Jacob. But the one woman he loves, he was a one-woman man. And he had 4 wives because of the troubles of his time, because of the complexities of his family, because of the frustrations of his own clan. He had to have 4 wives. The one he loved didn't bear until she's another 10 years. She's in her 40s. And suddenly she bears Joseph. She doesn't look anything like what she started out to at 16. And here's what's wonderful about Jacob. Jacob grew up by this struggle. His wife got older and older, and he got more and more frustrated. And rather than making him a bitter man, it made him a better man. He grew up. He learned how to love well, to love right. And that's why Joseph is born from a woman who taught Jacob a great lesson about what love is really about. And that's why he becomes the favored one who carries in a very, very profound way the gravity of that covenant all the way through to the next generation, and then right through the heart of the biblical text to the current dispensation of grace. Thank you.